Another principle that we really need to keep track of is that props are read-only. Okay? Don't change the props. They're passed to you from your parent. They're used to display. That does lead to a problem that sometimes things need to change, and they need to change in a parent. So how does one do that? So let's look at another example. Let's say we have a very simple application, and all we have is a name component and a date component. Okay, so these guys are actually components. So we have our app, we have a name, and we have a date. Okay. Component, component, and component. And we are trying to, right, this is a box where we display the current name, but we can also change the name. So what do we know? Well, we know that this name component, just by looking at it, what it does actually look like. If we look at the app, the JSX it's going to create is a name. And here we can pass in the name, or let's just pass in, again, let's just use the value. So our value is going to be whatever the current name is. So here, I guess it's really state information, isn't it? So maybe our app contains state. Okay, let's make the state be a person. And it's going to have a name field. Let's call it Joe. And a date field. And let's say this is 08/29/2020. Okay, so this person is state. So we would have a use state, and that would create us a person and a set person. So our value then is just going to be person dot name. And then we'll also have a date where we have a value of person dot date. These are in curly braces. And we close our element here, our JSX element. Okay, so that's how we're going to pass this down to our child components, the name and the date. If we look at the name, presumably we're going to have something like a div, and inside the div we'll have a label, and then we'll have a text. So we'll have an input, type equals text, and the value is equal to props.value. All right, so the question now is, how do we cause a change to occur? That is, how can we go ahead and type something in the name field? So, let's say we type an X in there. So if we look over here, or whatever let's say just the name, well, the name field is Joe. So we would expect this to initially be displaying Joe. But now let's say we type an X after there. Okay, what's going to happen? Well, what's going to happen is we can get an on change. event to the input. So let's go ahead and add in here an on change. Okay, and this is a function we pass in. The problem is we have got some state information, so we've got some change that we're making in a child. And where do we want that to be reflected? We don't want to just store this locally in the name, the state information. I mean, we could somehow keep track of the fact that we now have Joe X in the name, but eventually we've got to get it back up to the application. And so what we need to do is we have props that go down, right? And somehow we need a mechanism for getting changes to go back. The only information that passes from a parent to a child is props. So therefore, we're going to have to take advantage of that to get changes to get passed back. And basically what we're going to do is we're going to pass in props dot, and then we're going to provide some sort of, let's call it on name changed, possibly. Okay. And this is going to be a function in the app. And so when the name component finds that the name has changed, it's going to call its props.onNameChanged method. And so that will then notify the application of the change in the name. Okay, so let's just assume now that onNameChanged is going to get a new name. And let's look at how we might implement that. So what we would do is we would pass in here on name changed. And let's just think, what do we want to pass? Well, we want to pass a function that takes a name and then updates so that we now use that new name. So let's see. We can't use set person, right? Because that person takes an entire person. But what we could do is something like this, right? We can write a arrow function here. So we've got something that takes a name. And what do we want to do? Well, we know we want to call set person. But if we call set person, we're going to have to pass in a new person. So that is a object with a name and a date field. So let's just put this in right now like this. So we could put this in like this. Name and pass in the name. Maybe let's rename this. New name. This will be new name. And the date can be person.date. Okay. So that is the function. So the curly brace closes this curly brace, the paren closes the set person, and we need then another curly brace. Okay. So this is an appropriate function that will change the name. And then what do we got to do over here? Well, over here, what do we got to do? We've got an on change. So we know incoming, so there exists props.name change, props.on name changed. Okay. We know that a change method, so we need to write a function here. And this is a function that takes an event. And we know that the target's value contains the new updated name. So we can then call props.on name changed and then pass in the e.target.value. So let's go over what happens again here. The user types something or writes something into the input here. So that puts in an X. What happens? The input field has an onChanged method. The onChanged method gets passed a event. In the event is a target field, and in the target field is the value, which is now the new name. So it's now Joe X. What do we do in terms of that? We call onNameChanged with Joe X. OnNameChanged is going to then create a person whose name field is Joe X and whose date is the old date, and then call setPerson for that. Okay. We know setPerson is going to update the state information for the person, because that's what it does. And then, since the state information has changed, it'll re-render the app. That'll cause the name to re-render. So it's going to actually go through and re-render this name and re-render the input field. Okay. It doesn't actually create a new input field from scratch. It looks at the created JSX and the old JSX and finds what's changed is the value of the input field. And since the value has changed, and that's all that's changed, all it needs to do is update the value in the input. So it doesn't need to somehow remove the input field DOM object and create a new one. It just has to go update the value. And again, this idea of making the minimal set of changes. A couple things we should look at here. Okay, one, this right here, where we're creating this new object, works, but imagine if we had, instead of 2 fields, 10 fields. We'd be repeating 9 of them just to replace the name. So an alternate approach we could do here is to use the spread syntax. So we could say ... person, and then so that would basically fill in all the fields from the person into this particular new object, and then we could just sort of override the name field.